Welcome to Dialogues at Fulcrum, where we have conversations with experts and analysts on the latest geopolitical, economic, and cultural developments in Southeast Asia.
Good afternoon to all Fulcrum listeners. I'm Dr. William Choong, the Managing Director of Fulcrum, which is the commentary and analysis website published by the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute. Today, we're very honored to have Niclas Kvarnström, Managing Director of Asia and Pacific at the European Union External Action Service. Saw Niclas's 60-second pitch on the EU to the Indo-Pacific about how the Indo-Pacific is monumentally important to the EU, that it has 60% of the world's population, 60% of global output, and 60% of global greenhouse gases. I thought that was beautifully done, Niclas. So thanks, Niclas, for being here with us, taking the time. I just want to say that we are recording this in a highly secure area in the Shangri-La Hotel at the sidelines of the Shangri-La Dialogue. So thank you again, Niclas, for being with us.
William, thank you. It's really great to be here. And, those are the statistics that I always use to get my bosses to realize that, we really need to focus on Asia.
Thank you. So, Nick, let's jump straight into it. So previously you were the Swedish ambassador to Singapore, and we had many very insightful and enjoyable sessions talking about regional politics and security, whether it was at your mission or at your residence. But now you are the Managing Director of Asia and the Pacific at the EEAS. So to the layman in this part of the world, they'll be going like, man, that's like a big sounding title. So tell us a bit about what you do, what are your goals, and what's your business on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, the EEAS is the diplomatic service of the European Union. It's not an institution. Some parts of it is similar to if you were a country. So in my case, I'm head of Asia Pacific. We cover 41 countries. We have 27 EU delegations, so that would be EU embassies in the region. In fact, we're going on to Tokyo to have an ambassadors conference for all of those next week. The difference between being a country and a union is we draft policy options for Asia, but foreign policy in the European Union is something that ultimately requires support from all the 27 member states. First of all, inside Brussels, we work on getting unity among the member states for our positions, try to summarize, take initiatives, drive forward policies, but we always have to have that conversation with the member states. We also have the European Commission, which is really the source of the power of the European Union as the world's largest trading bloc in terms of actually executing much of our policy. So it also requires that the policies are designed with the European Commission power also taking that into account. And then finally, of course, even if we have forged a position from the member states, strategies that have the full power of the EU, we still have to conduct the diplomacy, which is, of course, the core of what we do. You could say that the delegations and our diplomacy in the field ultimately is like any diplomatic service. And so we try to use our diplomatic relations with all the countries in the region to build partnerships, to build relations that make the EU stronger and to try to advocate for our interests and our values.
Thanks for that. That sounds really ambitious and complicated. It sounds like you're talking about policy and needing to get agreement of all the 27 countries. It looks like foreign policy by committee as well as consensus at the same time, which is challenging to say the least. But did you say 41 missions in the Indo-Pacific?
First of all, I worked for a while at the United Nations, and there, some of the agreements we worked on there, like for example, I was part of negotiating an arms trade treaty, then you need consensus among 193. But and as ASEAN colleagues know, 10 can be tough enough, right? Yeah. But I would say that the advantage is that the EU is there. I think it's one of the greatest peace projects. At the end of the day, it came out of World War II, realizing that sharing prosperity means sharing security. And so once we have that consensus, and it's actually remarkable, people criticize us when we are not united, but it's also amazing the power of the EU when we are united and we use the full powers. Now, 41 is the number of countries in the region that we cover. 27 is the number of missions that we have in the region.
Okay, thanks for that. That was a good intro. Now, Niclas, we are speaking at the sidelines of the Shangri-La Dialogue, and we know that last night it was French President Emmanuel Macron who delivered the keynote, and he was talking about, in light of the geopolitical rivalry that we see between major powers, China and the United States, he's calling for positive new alliances that are based on common values, common norms, and common principles. Give us your assessment on that, and do you see opportunities as well as challenges in trying to effect that position in this part of the world?
No, thank you. And first of all, I should say that representing Europe here, I would say that it's quite impressive to see how many Europeans were here this year, from Emmanuel Macron with his keynote, my boss, Kaja Kallas, the High Representative and Vice President of the EU. I think 5 defense ministers from EU member states being here, which shows, I think, the huge interest that there is in the EU, even under the current circumstances, because, of course, in Europe, there's a full-blown illegal war of aggression that Russia is pursuing against Ukraine going on. There is a crisis in our southern neighborhood, in the Middle East with Gaza, and lots of other things. But even with that, people are nevertheless focused on this region. What I think is quite common theme in HRVP Kaja Kallas's intervention at the Shangri-La Dialogue and President Macron's is that we see from the European Union point of view a huge opportunity in this region. We are in a geopolitical time where some fundamental things are being challenged. And we think that the EU has an opportunity, since we are here for free trade in the classic sense. We can talk about that a little later, all the different free trade negotiations that we are pursuing in the region. We are still here for multilateralism, which we think is the foundation for cooperation and for security. That was the theme of the HRVP speech. We still are committed to combating climate change, which we know really hits this region. I remember serving as ambassador here, and interestingly, what happens up in the Arctic, part of the world that I come from, really affects here in the tropics, let's say rising sea levels when you have melting ice cap and so on. And of course, we are still partners in a green transition based on innovation and helping each other grow. And the EU being one of the 3 big economic powers in the world alongside the US and China, we feel this is an opportunity to build these partnerships. I think if we do that, we don't agree on everything, but we can agree on a rules-based foundation. We can agree that free trade leads to prosperity for the sides involved. We can agree that we should, with the UN Charter and multilateral system at the core, build sort of a rules-based approach, whether you talk about maritime security or you're talking about rules of the road for trade, for example. So that's our hope. And I think, honestly, in this geopolitical context, we see a greater interest in the region. I've covered the region for a long time. And I do think that we really find each other trying to form a meshwork around these things. So it's up to us to forge the partnerships. And that's why we have the European Union strategy for the Indo-Pacific, for example.
Thanks a lot for that. And there's a very magisterial kind of tour de force of EU approach to the region, trade, investment, climate change. I just want to zero in on the trade dimension. You're talking about all these agreements and multilateral trading system. We all know that the US under Trump 2.0 has adopted a pretty different position on trade with reciprocal tariffs. To me, as a Singaporean, as a Southeast Asian, it looks like, we used to have this terminology called the New World and the World, the Americas being the new and the Europe being the old. But it seems like to Asians today that the European Union is really the old world, in the sense that you are the old world which embrace that multilateral trading system, which now the US seems to be moving away from. The US, as you know, famously withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017. And now in Trump 2.0, there's all these reciprocal tariffs that has invited a lot of controversy. So let's talk now on how the building blocks between negotiations for an EU-ASEAN trading agreement. And the UK, not part of the EU now, but the UK has now joined the Comprehensive Partnership for Trans-Pacific Partnership. And there's a lot of commentariat analysts now in this part of the world that are saying, why can't we get the European Union into the CPTPP? Because, as you know, the CPTPP's DNA was a high-quality free trade agreement between the US and another 11 countries. Now that the US is out, UK is in, why can't we get the rest of the European Union in? So that's the general direction of travel. So give us a sense of what your thoughts are on these mega coalescing deals that we see.
Well, I would say, first of all, just in case somebody ends up listening to this in Brussels, that the caveat here is I'm not a trade specialist. Okay. There's the Directorate General for Trade in the Commission that negotiates on behalf of the EU. However, I'll say some general things. First of all, I think for the European Union and the member states of the EU, we fundamentally believe in free trade. We think that it is something that builds prosperity together. Our prosperity came out of free trade. Of course, having said that, it's important that we are sticking to the rules-based trade, but it becomes problematic if you're the only large actor that does that. So that's why sometimes we also have to defend ourselves. But fundamentally, we would like to build as wide a network as possible of free trade agreements. And I think that is what we are pursuing here in this region. The EU, we already have a free trade agreement. Singapore, as usual, Singapore is always top of the class, right? So now you have a FTA, digital trade and digital agreement with us. And we have with Singapore, we have one with Vietnam. We also have one with New Zealand, but we are negotiating with India, with Australia, with Malaysia, with the Philippines, with Indonesia, and with Thailand. And the hope is that this is a foundation for a very mutually beneficial relationship between this region and Europe. It's not really a coincidence. I think we have tried to look around the corner to our future. And we know that if you look at where future growth will come from, future markets, future talent, future technology, a lot of that is dependent on a good relationship with this region. And if you look at what the region that we call the Indo-Pacific, I jokingly call it the banana-shaped route, but essentially a lot of our connectivity, a lot of our supply chains, a lot of our big chunk of our trade essentially travels that sort of. So that's what we are trying to, in the middle of everything else, keep our focus on. I would also say, because we're talking about trade, I'm sure you'll get around to that. We're here for a security conference on security and trade. I think our position of being this very, very large trade actor is also the start of an addition or shared security with the region. Yeah. I say that because it's not the case that we have a European Union Navy out here in the region, or that we are going to field one anytime soon here. But when we stand up for principles of international law, for example, here, with the economic power backing that up, that we think is a contribution to security. On top of that, we are building security and defense partnerships in the region. We just agreed with Japan and Korea. We're hopeful where there's an interest in pursuing something like that. It's up to the member states ultimately, but perhaps with India, perhaps with Australia and others. And then we try to focus on various security-related programs that we have for maritime security, for things like cyber, FEMI, and other things. Things that are really not only challenges that are common to the two regions. You could take something like North Korea as a challenge, security challenge to both this region and to ours, but cyber and things that hit us, but also things that are going to be difficult to combat or address unless we do it together. So that's kind of our approach to the region. But of course, with the European Union, it starts with our power as an economic actor.
Absolutely. Which is a good segue, Nicholas, to my institute's flagship publication. It's called the State of Southeast Asia Survey. So that was released in April, and I'm sure you've read it. So basically, the European Union scored really high in terms of being the second most trusted partner to Southeast Asian elites. In the eyes of Southeast Asian elites, only second to Japan, which is kind of a long-standing partner in this part of the world. In terms of strategic relevance, though, the EU ranked fourth after China, the US, and Japan. So just to put it in a nutshell, elite respondents in Southeast Asia rated the European Union for its adherence to international norms, its principles on the environment, human rights, and climate change. But the EU is somewhat ranked lower on strategic relevance. So it's kind of a dichotomy here, and you've kind of given us the answer. You're a heavyweight in terms of the economics, in terms of the trade, in terms of the investments. But on the security arena, you are playing kind of a subsidiary or supplementary role to the US's traditional role as a security guarantor to this part of the world. So maybe you want to give some of your thoughts on that.
Yes, and so of course, I'm a diplomat, so I'll start with the easy bit. Yeah, no, but I think first of all, I'm a fan and follower of the survey since many years. Discovering it, of course, here when I served as ambassador here, I think it's very useful. Of course, it's interesting that it can sort of fluctuate a little bit because of the limited sample over time. But I have noticed over the years, if you take sort of like a baseline over many years. For the EU, it's very clear that the categories that we score typically high on would be credibility when it comes to trade, credibility when it comes to climate change or green transition, and credibility when it comes to global rules or norms or rules-based order, that kind of stuff. And before I go to the security bit, I think those are very good categories to be trusted on. We built a big part of our Indo-Pacific strategy around those baskets of, one where we do economic cooperation, trade, connectivity, digital, one basket that is sort of green and climate change and environment. And then there is the security basket. And it is true, and I have lived this, spending so much time out here in the region over the years, that people are always, sometimes I joked with Australian colleagues that sometimes our best friends are most honest critics, and over the years they always said, yeah, but how credible is it? I think we've grown in credibility on the security side. We're certainly working on it. I think that trustworthiness and credibility and reliability, those are some of the best things you can have in diplomacy. And if you combine that with, as I said, an economic heft and an increasing focus on security, I put it this way, that we're not a security provider to the region. But what we can do is we can play a role where we, together with our partners, actually help make this region more secure and vice versa. I think we really had, it's hard to overestimate just how much the war in Ukraine, Russia's full-scale invasion, the impact it has had on European security thinking. And the EU, as I said, it was designed as a peace project after two horrible world wars. And the theme of Kaja Kallas's speech is that 80 years after the end of World War II, we really should take stock. Are we throwing, hard-won lessons, wisdom, systems out the window unnecessarily? And I think, so for the EU, you take something like an 800 billion euro package for defense that was agreed in the EU. That's something entirely new for the EU. And it's come out of the Ukraine war and the realization that we have to play an absolutely key role in taking responsibility for our own defense, for our own security, and for European security order. And in fact, the war challenges the very concept of the EU as an open project, open to all European democracies that want to go down that quite difficult path to get membership. So doing all that work, we've also realized that a big chunk of that, and you take Ukraine, it's something that is a part of global diplomacy. You cannot do these things alone. And it gets even more complicated when you get into new areas like AI or cyber or data and so on. And we need partners. And the broader the kind of coalition that we can build of partners who share fundamentally, not everything on values and so on, but fundamental ideas of the rules of the game, the better. So in summary, I would say, conscious of the fact that, especially if you compare to China, which is in the region, and I think China's military buildup, if I'm not mistaken, is the single largest one since World War II. And then the United States, which is, of course, a massive military power in the region since World War II, with a sophisticated alliance system. Of course, if you compare to that, then we are obviously not going to be a security player to that extent. But I do think that countries in the region here will see us as an appreciated part of something that is sophisticated in terms of together defending norms, rules, modus. And essentially, I come back to the fact the European Union is really a grouping of mainly, even Germany, even Poland and so on, are in the grand scheme of things. You look at your neighbor here just across the water, Indonesia, with 285 million people. We are middle-sized or small countries, but in a grouping. And when we meet our partners in ASEAN, even though Indonesia is in there, for example, there's a sense that it cannot be that one or two or three powers set all the rules. We have to, those of us who agree with the UN Charter at its core, we should build coalitions around that.
Thanks a lot for that, Niclas. Now you talk about how China is spending the most on military modernization since the war, the US being the biggest security guarantor, but the EU playing a somewhat smaller but important role. It brings to mind a famous quip that Stalin was quoted as saying when he was asked to propitiate the Pope, and Stalin famously answered, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" Yeah. And I think I use this all the time when I talk to my European Union friends. But that said, jibes aside, I think you're bringing some serious capability, even though you're playing a subsidiary role. We've seen French carrier groups, we've seen a German expeditionary naval group come across to the Indo-Pacific last year. The UK, again, not part of the European Union, still a European power that has a carrier strike group coming through, aided by members of NATO navies as well. So I think that this is something that Asian countries actually welcome, in a sense that You have middle powers in their own right with expeditional capability who can actually bring power and presence to send a deterrent signal to whoever wants to disrupt the so-called rules-based order. So I want to just emphasize that you are pretty much welcome in this part of the world to, I think it was Lee Kuan Yew, the founding Prime Minister of Singapore, who said that we're not choosing any particular country, but what we want is a balance in the regional power balance. And I think the European Union is playing a good part in that as well. So kudos to you. I just want to move along to.
Let me just say, first of all, on that, just that, just a quick comment that, well, first of all, of course, I prefer quotes from Lee Kuan Yew a lot more than quotes from Stalin. But yes, it's true that they're not going to be a full, battle group coming in from Europe. But these sort of member states doing these port calls, doing these freedom of navigation operations and so on, I think that, and when we speak up, which we do at the European Union level, when we feel that it's in our interest, really, really hard economic and security interest, that, say, the status quo in Taiwan Straits or South China Sea, if there were to be conflict in this area, would have a huge impact on us. So when we speak up in defense of UNCLOS in the South China Sea, or in defense of the status quo across the Taiwan Strait, or when member states send assets to the region, that's a signal to say that we stand for these rules and norms, with all what it means in terms of what an economic actor like us can stand for when we definitely don't like something. And we will have seen in Ukraine when we definitely are, facing an existential threat, what we can do on the economic side. So sorry, I couldn't resist.
Thanks for that. Actually, now that you mentioned it, just to have a caveat on what I said about regional publics in Asia welcoming all these European expeditionary groups, I think Asians are generally a more cautious people. So we are seeing actually, of course, the war in Ukraine is now into its, third, fourth year even. Yeah. So the basic question is, given that you have all these preoccupations at home on the continent with Russia and with Ukraine, can you continue to send these kind of expeditionary forces to the Indo-Pacific? I think there was a Financial Times report that basically quoted American officials telling their Royal Navy counterparts, the Royal Navy shouldn't be sending expeditionary forces to the Indo-Pacific, but you should basically be maintaining your naval forces on the European continent simply because that's your first rank of priority. Again, the UK is not part of the EU, but I think that kind of logic is transferable to Germany or to France or to Italy, EU countries that have sent expeditionary forces to the region. So is this going to be a problem that you have that preoccupation in Ukraine, whether that will restrain or constrain your deployments to the Indo-Pacific?
I think that the European Union is not about gunboat diplomacy. In that sense, it's similar to the Asian cautious approach. What I think these patrols are doing is not threatening anyone. It's building partnerships to show that we collectively care about certain rules, let's say UNCLOS, freedom of navigation, and so on. And those kind of deployments, it's absolutely something we prioritize because we know that these norms, these rules are common to what we call the Euro-Atlantic and to the Indo-Pacific. And in the same way, I think that, I know that our partners out here, Singapore, which I really would like to commend for, and Singapore doing this for its own reasons as an independent state, standing up for Ukraine. Same way we see with Singapore, with, let's say, Australia, Japan, this commitment to supporting Ukraine. For us too, in return, we would like to show commitment to security in this region. And so I think that in a way you could say the more you care about your own security, the more you will need support for that security. And you cannot do that without also showing support. Having said that, of course, this is the challenge of a lifetime, what we are facing in Ukraine. And it's true that it's all hands on deck in Europe. And that's why you see this dramatic focusing of efforts, of resources on defending Ukraine. And that will be first priority. And I think one thing that we do definitely agree with is that Europe does have to increase its defense spending, have that wake-up call, take greater responsibility for its own security. And by the way, you mentioned the United Kingdom, and I think that's one of the outcomes as well of the discussions recently, that some of that stuff we will do together with them. And by the way, in this region, we have a very good dialogue with them on some of the issues here.
Now that you mentioned about that, the European Union needing to up its defense spending, you mentioned that $800 million defense capability upgrade. We are here at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and you sat in when US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth talked about that 5% figure, that European countries are kind of aiming for 5% of GDP on defense spending, and basically Secretary Hegseth said that Asian countries should be doing the same. And we were talking about this before we hit record on the podcast, Niclas. So what are your thoughts? I personally think that it's not well thought of to ask Asian countries for 5%.
Well, I'm trying to see how I answer this question. Yeah, exactly, but without getting myself into hot water. Yeah, exactly. In many places. Yeah, no. But I think, first of all, the decision on defense spending is a national decision for each country to make independently, and in its own interest. It has to be that way. It is that way in the EU. So even though we have common goals, and by the way, over at NATO and so on. Ultimately, it is up to each country to decide on its defense spending. And that certainly is true out here as well. Singapore is a country that always, I think, has taken its national defense very seriously. So that, I think, is the most important thing to say. But two other remarks. One is that in Europe, we, as I said, given the worsening, darkening security situation in Europe because of Russia and Russia's aggression. The HRVP, Kaja Kallas, said it in her speech that you have to prepare in peacetime for war, and that is your best guarantee to avoid a war. And we probably, I think there are many people, at least in Europe, who feel that maybe it would have been better if we had done that earlier in many places. Others will comment on that. But certainly, as I said, I think our feeling now is that we really have to do this to take care of our security in this very kind of difficult situation that we find ourselves in. And to your region here, without prescribing anything to the countries here, because they need to be national decisions, but just to say there are also rising tensions in parts of this region, and the underlying force of a geopolitical competition with all the risks that entails, and misunderstandings and sensitive hotspots and so on, I can see how countries would in this region also choose to take a look at its defense and do what we are doing, which is to look for partners to share the parts of security that we can work together on and make our, each of us stronger through that.
Thanks for that. That's a very well thought of diplomatic answer.
Did I get myself in trouble?
Yeah, no. Okay, so you mentioned sensitive hotspots. Again, President Macron mentioned in his keynote last night about how there are quote-unquote revisionist powers who are trying to establish spheres of influence on the fringe of Europe, and as well as in archipelagic waters in the South China Sea. No prizes for guessing which kind of revisionist powers that the French president is talking about. So you mentioned, Niclas, about the importance of the European Union, when it comes to contentious issues like the South China Sea, coming up to uphold international law, international principles, UNCLOS, and all that. So tell me more about how the European Union and countries that are involved in this very tendentious, very thorny problem of the South China Sea. What can we do beyond just upholding international law?
Yeah, I think that one of the lessons of coming out of the world wars is that in Europe we saw that in a very, very devastating, ugly way. What happens when autocratic powers trample smaller countries, walk across borders, annex, invade, commit war crimes, and so on. Some of the most horrible stories. You saw it in Asia as well. Yeah. And so the world order that came out of that was born out of an idea that we would formulate a system that would protect everyone, including small countries, from might is right. And that, I think, is the fundamental thing that we're trying to protect. Now, we do see tendencies of large countries. I mean, Russia is this is in violation of every basic principle there is of the UN Charter and every single European security agreement from Helsinki to Budapest to Paris, right? So, the agreements, not the places. And we see in your region. That's why I said, if we think that it's clear that in the South China Sea that there have been changes to facts on the ground, for example, military installations on, reclaimed islands, and this is a very, very difficult thing where you have so many overlapping claims. So we do speak out for that reason, that there has to be a respect for international law, for UNCLOS, in the case of the South China Sea. And on Russia and China, because I suspect that you may perhaps be hinting at who knows, right? But I would say one concern for us, which I think was also clearly expressed in the speech by the HRVP, is that we are concerned when you see large countries sort of teaming up against principles like that. We come back to Xi Jinping saying goodbye to Putin, saying that, this phrase of change is not seen in 100 or hundreds of years. We lead them together. China, I'm not sure they understand how scary that is to us, because we know what Russia did. But we do know, and this is an ongoing dialogue that we have with our Chinese partners, interlocutors, that when you have, in our case, the European Union, we are the largest trading partner that China has, a situation where 80%, something like that, of dual-use goods or everything from like microelectronics and so on, components going from or via China, that's something we feel that when we are such large partners, they have to address. When you have an independent sovereign state like Ukraine being invaded by another country, and that is a country that China had a very large and important relationship with, that you have to stand up for that country. And then when you have processes towards peace process or a solution or a ceasefire for that matter, it has to be based on international law and the UN Charter. That's a fairly fundamental thing. And we keep coming back to who is the victim and who is the aggressor. And there is a major difference between that. So for all these reasons, I think it's in our interest. We don't hesitate to speak up when we feel that big countries take liberties with international law.
Thanks for that. That's a very nice way of ending. And I think I remember it correctly, the way China is handling, smaller South China Sea claimant states is a kind of emblematic of a great power on the rise. And I think the best example is, I think it was 2010, when Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi was speaking to a group of ASEAN foreign ministers, and basically he sketched out the bottom line that they are big countries and they are small countries, and reportedly he was looking at the Singaporean foreign minister. So increasingly you guys live in a kind of a rough neighborhood now with Russia and Ukraine. I guess the people in Southeast Asia, we kind of have the same feelings about that. So thanks a lot, Nick, for
Thank you.
Really taking the time. I think this was a really insightful conversation. I think we could have gone on for another 40 minutes, but
I know we're such nerds, how we can do this all day.
You have much important things to do this evening, but really thanks again, and thanks for taking the time. And I hope to see you in Brussels in about 13 days, I think.
I look forward to that. And once again, it's great to be back in Singapore, old home, so to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us in our conversation on Dialogues at Fulcrum. If you want to access more of our analysis on Southeast Asia, please check out fulcrum.sg. Dialogues at Fulcrum is brought to you by the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute. We look forward to sharing more insightful conversations with you in subsequent episodes. See you then!